to talk to me, just put it in the comments.
Cool.
Or in the private chat.
Okay.
Sure.
Oh, also, and just to let everyone know, I think we had 45 people sign up for Eventbrite as of 4 hours ago. So
hopefully they have all joined us now.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, welcome to this South Asia Heritage Month hosted event on Divided Lands, Divided Tongues. This is been led by the Partition Education Group. So we're developed from a UK campaign to officially commemorate partition, and we want to see the teaching of partition in UK schools and other educational institutions, in addition to seeing other South Asian history, not just partition, so that we can have young people connected with learning about Britain's tumultuous past, especially, I think, in light of colonial reckoning and a need to understand how events such as partition contribute to the story of Britain's past. So it's very excited to welcome you here. I've been looking forward to this all week. Would love you to drop some stuff in comments for us. Hopefully we'll be able to see those live, and do feel free to drop any questions as we go along as well. So as a very quick introduction, my name's Kat. Hi. I'm chairing this event. I'm currently the Partition Education Group Secretary. So I originally got involved with the group through my role as Educational Coordinator at Manchester Museum. So here I supported developments for a South Asia gallery, as well as part of their Hello Future development, and then co-curated the museum's Jallianwala Bagh 1919 Punjab Under Siege exhibition. And this was in partnership with the Partition Museum in India, commemorating 100 years ago since the fateful massacre of peaceful protesters by the British Army in Jallianwala Bagh. It happened to win a University of Museum Making a Difference Award, highly commended in the Asian Museum Award, and shortlisted in Museums and Heritage Awards. So I was hugely impressed with everything that was going on around this topic, and that precipitated me getting involved with the Partition Education Group. So while I did leave the museum last year in the midst of a pandemic to follow my own dreams, becoming a writer and writing coach, I'm very, very, very passionate about the need for young people to understand Britain's link with South Asia, both historically and culturally. So we've also got here Amina Malik, who is our vice chair and who very kindly spearheaded all the organisation for this event. So Amina, do you want to just say a quick few words about who you are and how you got involved with us?
Yeah, so hey everyone, as Kat said, I'm the vice chair of the Partition Education Group. So I got involved with the group actually when it was first set up, and that was through a project called Project Dastan. It was a project aiming to connect partition witnesses back with their childhood homes through VR technology. So that was a project I set up while I was at university. I'm now a chemistry graduate, been on some sort of gap year and doing a lot of work for PEG. It's been really fun, to be honest, and I think for me, I've stayed involved all of these years because of the mission that we're trying to achieve here, which is to see better representation of ourselves, our culture, our history, not just our history, but British history within the education system. We've got a fantastic team as well at PEG, and we've got a huge network of really supportive people. And I'm hoping that events like this is our first event actually, and I'm hoping that events in the future as well help us to showcase and sort of raise awareness for the fact that this is a kind of history that people need to learn about, because people are so unaware and not informed enough, and young people don't feel represented within their education systems. That's a fact. And I mean, while organizing this event, I'm really, really excited to get into this discussion. The more I spoke to the individual speakers here today, potential speakers that couldn't make it, and then while I was sharing this event, I had so many interesting discussions. And I think I've realized this topic of language is so complex within South Asia, within diaspora communities. And I'm sure we could spend many, many hours and days discussing it. But I hope that this is the start.
Fab, thank you very much. So yeah, as Amina said, we are here today to talk about language, how it is both influenced by and influences culture, how it changes and evolves over time, and as a result, how events in our past like partition could be like a catalyst for language development and change. So we could argue that it's not just history that teaches about partition, but also the way that language has evolved as a result. So let me introduce our amazing speakers. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of who they are, and then I'll ask each of them to share a little bit about their interest and expertise for our topic this evening. And then we'll get down to some really specific questions. And as I said, if you do have any questions or comments, please do share them in the comments wherever you're watching today. And I'm hoping that we will be able to see them in real time. And we'll try and leave time for some question and answers at the end. So we're hoping to finish no later than 8 p.m. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to one of our first speakers, Wajid Yassin. So he is a Manchester-born, London-based artist whose work draws on an interdisciplinary approach to develop sound-based works encompassing installations, live performances, acousmatic music, graphic scores, and sound sculptures. Wajid is the director of the sound art research cooperative Modus Arts, the co-founder of the Destructivist Scapegoat Project, and director of the Ear Cinema Project. He holds an MA in Arts and Design with a focus on sonic arts, and his work has been exhibited and performed at the ICA Gallery, Arnaud Fini, Queen Elizabeth Hall, the Whitechapel Gallery, Laban, and the Freud Museum. So Wajid, welcome. Do you want to share a quick perspective on why you're here with us today?
Yes, so yeah, I'm Wajid, and I used to be a music producer 20 odd years ago, so sort of making music, making albums, touring around the world, being a silly bugger really. And about 10 years ago, I stumbled on sonic arts as a discipline, and shifted my focus from composition into thinking about all the sort of creative possibilities with sound as a medium. So sort of branching out from just composition. And I've worked on sort of various projects over the years. And for the last 3 years or so, I've been working on a oral history project. So it's actually one of the very few projects that isn't an arts project. This is an oral history project that's sort of being realized through the lens of art. And the project called Tape Letters. And essentially it looks at the use of cassette tapes by people who migrated from Pakistan to the UK in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the interesting thing about that is the language that was on these cassettes is an oral-only language. And so the cassettes themselves are a strange sort of preserve of language. And I mean, as soon as sort of Amina found out about this, she was like, I want you to talk about this. So here I am.
I'm sure there's going to be lots of examples that you can share about language and its change and development as we go through the event. Thank you very much, Wajid. I'm just going to say hello to Rizwan from Doha in Qatar. It's nice to have an international audience, so thank you for that comment. Hello to you too. So our next speaker is Amina Yakin, who is a reader in Urdu and post-colonial studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her monograph, Gender, Sexuality and Feminism in Pakistan Women's Poetry, is forthcoming with Anthem Press this year. She's co-author with Peter Morey of Framing Muslims, Stereotyping and Representation After 9/11, and has co-edited Contesting Islamophobia, Media, Politics and Culture, Muslims, Trust and Multiculturalism, New Directions, and also Culture, Diaspora and Modernity in Muslim Writing. Her research is interdisciplinary and engages with contemporary context of Muslim life, as well as the politics of culture in Pakistan, where she grew up. Amina, welcome. Do you want to just give us a quick flavour of why our topic is of interest to you today?
Sure. Hello, thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I think I'm here, because for this project that I really think is a very important one about the teaching of partition in sort of the UK education system. My own connection to it comes from my, I'll give you a bit of my biography. I grew up in Lahore in family, which is a Kashmiri and a Punjabi family, where Punjabi was spoken at home and Urdu was the language that we learnt and grew up with, and English was part of my education very much. And therefore, the relationship to language was very interesting. You know, coming out of migrant parents and a migrant kind of presence in Pakistan. And it wasn't sort of something, I suppose there was a question of why didn't our parents speak to us in Punjabi, or they did speak to us in Punjabi, but why weren't we, in a sense, encouraged to take it up in the same way as we were Urdu and English? Those were questions that have taken me on a long journey that has found me here. And I have thought about how language influences culture and how it's influenced by culture in my academic work as well, both through the work that I do on Urdu poetry and on women's writing, and also about the in the context of national language within Pakistan that Urdu has, and its relationship to other languages and communities. So how do we understand community and how do we understand language when we think about those different factors? And then how do they impact our relationship to partition and the way we look back at that history? So going to school in Pakistan and college in Pakistan, you know, I had a kind of ideological education of Pakistani history, in which partition was also taught quite well, not really taught, but it's an interesting sort of journey, ideological journey. It's a part of the two-nation theory and all those sorts of things. So when you come outside and you look at that from the lens of the diaspora when you're in the UK, and also thinking about it, I've been here for more than half my life now, so it's a different perspective, you know, connecting with the communities here and how the relationship to language evolves and changes, and the longer history, of course, of those languages and the colonial state is something that I've come to appreciate and teach, and is kind of connected to my study of literature and culture. Fascinating. Yeah, I think you'll have I feel like you're going to have a lot to say. I think everyone's going to have a lot to say, so we're going to there's so much fascinating depth to everything that we're going to talk about. So without further ado, we also have with us Dr. David Lunn. He is a senior teaching fellow and research associate in South Asian and post-colonial studies in the School of Languages, Culture and Linguistics at Leeds, I think. Is that right, David? No. Sorry.
SOAS.
So apologies there. My brain's not with us entirely. So elements of David's doctoral research on Hindi, Urdu and the politics of language in early 20th century India have been published in Bioscope and Modern Asian Studies, and his time on the Musical Transitions Project has resulted in published collaborations on a previously neglected Malay Shair chronicling the Muhram commemorations in Singapore in 1864, and on the poetry and song of the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, viewed through the prism of emotions and conceptual history. Most recently, he's begun a project on the Indo-Irish writer and satirist Aubrey Menon, and his first publication on that now little-remembered author appeared in the 2019 volume Queer Asia, Decolonizing and Reimagining Sexuality and Gender. So yeah, David, do you want to give us a quick overview of why you're here today?
Sure. Thank you, Kat, and thanks also to Amina for organising this. And it's great to be here with the panel. I suppose actually, as with Amina, a little bit of biography would be appropriate here. If only because it's not often you'd see someone like me coming to talk about Hindi and Urdu and languages like that. Yeah, I mean, Hindi and Urdu and the politics of language really became a real interest of mine, and eventually the focus of my PhD research. Really, after a series of quite weird accidents and coincidences, right? But as a teenager, I was very lucky to get to Delhi and to North India on a trip. Partnering with an NGO there for a relatively short time, but got interested in India and in South Asia more broadly, and then stumbled across this idea of a degree where I could study Hindi, learn the language, spend more time in the subcontinent in South Asia, and get more associated with it. And the idea that I would go on to do, make an academic career out of this was not there then, but there were a few moments, particularly during a year abroad when I was intensely studying Hindi in Jaipur, This must have been back in about 2004 or so. And I always remember this comment, chatting with the family, the host family I was living with as a paying guest. And there was another gentleman there. And at some point, someone passed me something and I said, shukriya, you know. And this man said, Are shukriya mat kaho, ye videshi shabd hai, dhanyavad kaho. So don't say shukriya, it's a foreign word. Say dhanyavad, for thank you. And this was a moment, it wasn't the only moment, and it wasn't, an isolated incident, but it was one of those moments that sort of struck me as linguistically, but also kind of socially interesting. Like, what is this idea of shukriya or something as being this Urduness, as being foreign, as being other? And of course, I think there are associations. I mean, I myself am from Belfast in Northern Ireland. It's not like the politics of language and community are unknown to those of us from that part of the world either. But it really kind of stuck with me, and eventually led me into kind of research on the colonial era in particular, and onto the idea of Hindustani and we'll maybe talk about that as a concept a little bit later. So historical research interest, yes, but it's also not something that's gone away. And these are pressing issues even today, I think. So.
Great, I love that that personal story about how you got actually pulled into this topic. Finally, last but not least, we have Tamara Hack. Tamara is a Bangladeshi Australian who has also lived in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. She's held on strongly to her roots, celebrating Bengali culture, food and language. She is a public sector strategist by day and children's author by night. Her aims are to diversify and decolonize bookshelves and increase Muslim and South Asian representation in children's books, which is definitely something, as a writer myself, that I think we need in the industry. But Tamara, do you want to share with us a little bit about how Amina got you involved and why you're here today?
Yeah, sure. So I follow Partition Education Group on Instagram, and then I saw that Amina was looking for Bangladeshi or Punjabi writers, and that's how I reached out to her and we got involved. So I am academically, I did my postgraduate degree in international relations, international trade law, and my coursework was on post-colonial theory and the impact on the global North and South relationship. So while growing up, so as Kat mentioned, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. So by the age of 10, growing up in a very multicultural background, I was speaking Bengali, English, Arabic, a mixture of Hindi and Urdu by the age of 10. And so there was a lot of that exposure. And while growing up, I guess I started becoming a bit more woke and seeing the impact basically that colonialism left in our languages and the relationship between each of these countries. I guess that piqued my interest into it. And yeah, that's and also when we're talking about the South Asian relationship, Bangladesh is often left out of the narrative. It's mostly more of an India and Pakistan relationship that we talk about. So I wanted to bring in my Bengali perspective into it, and also learn from the others over here as well tonight.
Fantastic, thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for reaching out. So you can find the Partition Education Group both on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love a follow, and we'd love you to continue the conversation over there. So those are our speakers for this evening. We're going to get into some questions, but I just thought I'd say hello to everyone from Malaysia watching. Nice to see you. And to also our chair who's on the comments, Raj. She is with us as an audience member this evening. So hi, Raj. Hope you're doing all right. So let's get into this then. Let's get into the discussion. Amina, how do you think language has influenced culture, or even vice versa, over time? How would you say language is used for example, cultural preservation, and how important is it? And do you think this differs in the UK and South Asia, for example? So Urdu in Pakistan, as you mentioned, versus Urdu in the UK.
Sorry, David predicted this, didn't he? That we'd forget to unmute, and I just did it. So thank you for that question. I'm going to try and answer it. It's quite a huge question. So But it is a good question because it connects with one of the things that I teach in a module that I do on Imagining Pakistan, which is on the cultural politics of language and how we think through the language itself, beginning with sort of thinking about it, geographically, the landscape where we are in South Asia with it, and how the geographic sphere that it's a part of, the culture that it's a part of, the Indic and the Islamic the sort of Islamic cultural contexts that have influenced it. So just as well as the Hindavi and different traditions within the Indian sort of subcontinent that are part of the linguistic traditions. So the hybridity of Urdu is so important to think about when you're thinking about Urdu, and the geographic sphere helps you to understand that. And then, of course, is the question of the nation and the community. How do you that question when you come to a place like Pakistan, do you talk about Urdu as a cultural product or as an Islamic language for an Islamic nation? And that's why I was using the term Islamicate, because it's sort of civilization thought about or talked about by historians as more of a civilizational kind of term by somebody like Marshall Hodgson, and really bringing in styles that are coming through from Arabic and Persian traditions geographically across Afro-Asia. So it's a very big canvas that you're drawing on, and it's important that this sort of remains part of that, I suppose, multicultural that is part of the language. But when you get to a very nationalist perspective, which is more patriotic, those things can become watered down, and language, as we saw in partition especially, became divided along communal lines. So community becomes really the defining feature of how people begin to think of themselves in relation, or how people are made to think of themselves in relation to, there's a bit of both, isn't there? You're made to think about it and you also participate in it. It sort of doesn't happen independently. There are two things. And there are colonial politics that are going on. There's the kind of issue of language, of script, of religious community. Religion is a very sort of religious community is such a huge part of how people define themselves within the region. And then when the kind of agency of the colonial state then intervenes in such a way that language and politics become really quite influential, then that changes the relationship people have with language in relation to religion. And Urdu becomes really, quite interestingly, also a language of power. And I know David's going to speak about this maybe later, so I won't talk too much about it. You've also got to think about things that sort of bring Urdu into greater circulation, like the printing presses and the 19th century, again, something, the sort of whole modernization project. And that changes, again, the relationship to language and how people think about language, and how that kind of relationship sort of shifts between linguistic communities, between Hindi and Urdu. And also you've got quite an elite patronage of Urdu that is coming, that is sort of thought of in relation to what is called Urdu-e-Mualla and the kind of Persian courts. And so it's it's really quite a lot of things in terms of a closed system that is dominated really by elite spaces. Or do we think about it as, or do you want to think about it as a lingua franca, as a more kind of hybrid language that sort of evolves in the camps, and it evolves in sort of what the story goes in the Turkish camps, and then is a kind of language on the ground, a language of communication, what is the heritage that you get in Pakistan, and why, does Punjabi, for example, lose its status in the Punjab to the extent that is not so much a language of power anymore? And those are the sort of questions that come in relation to language and culture. So yeah, I don't know if my 2 minutes are up, but I could
no,
go on.
As you said, there is so much here to discuss, and I really like the way that you've highlighted those influences that can change language within a culture and historical setting. Things like colonial rule, religion, the fact that it's very much sometimes the recording of language can be quite an elite thing. As someone who was very much into archaeology and Egyptology, you always see things being recorded by the elite. So it'd be quite interesting actually to ask Vajid with regards to the fact that obviously he's using tape letters and looking at those oral languages, how he finds this. Vajid, do you want to jump on and contribute?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's interesting for me to be surrounded by academics who really know their stuff, and it's David in particular. It's really interesting for me to know that you can speak Urdu and Hindi and these other languages, given that isn't kind of where your ethnicity obviously lies, right? I just to give you an idea of kind of my relationship to language, my parents are both farmers, right? And I don't identify as working class anymore, although my son mocks me for saying class, because obviously he pronounces it as class, right? And this is tied into the way we understand language and essentially how we can frame the kind of languages that we use. So it's interesting because you guys are able to sort of look at this from this very interesting perspective, right? And sort of see these wider political events that have shaped language in this kind of way. Whereas my sort of experience is slightly different in that I've not really had access to that way of looking at language. In fact, it's just, it's been really quite a muddy experience. And I've been trying to, over the last 3 years in particular, working on tape letters, trying to make sense of it, actually. It's only now that I'm trying to make sense of even trying to name the language we speak. We didn't even know it. It was actually misnamed. So the language that I was told we spoke was Punjabi, and in fact it isn't, right? So it's really interesting to sort of hear and me find out. In fact, I'm going to be tonight. I'm expecting to find out, learn a lot more about it actually, just by virtue of us being together. But yeah, I mean, this thing about technology and essentially how that can relay what is caught, especially something that I'm interested in, which is the oral nature of this particular language that we're looking into. Like my father sort of taught me how to read and write Urdu, but I wasn't particularly proficient with the thing, it never really sort of sat with me. And we spoke obviously Pothwari at home. Pothwari is essentially a sort of a scummy kind of, mountain dialect. That's kind of how it's seen, right? It's the language of the poor, uneducated, the great unwashed, right? And so we were sort of obviously taught Urdu as a way of trying to, aspire to something slightly better, but never really sat well with me. Actually, Urdu never sat with me and the reason why is that every single time everyone spoke Urdu to me, it was entirely with condescension, entirely related to class. Look at someone like me and go, yeah, Tamara Hack, right? Rather than O tera naam kya hai, right? So for me, it was the sort of this class was entirely fused, with language and the way it was treated. And of course, when I go to Pakistan now, they have no way of discerning any idea about who I am, and so will still treat me as a Pothwari speaking scumbag, right? So I'm interested sort of in some of these, and maybe you can sort of shine light on some of the splits in the language and kind of how it's been fractured, and maybe we'll sort of I can relay some of the some of the ideas, at least some of the experiences that we've had in terms of the way it was misnamed, right, and maybe some of the kind of the ways that it was expressed in our homes and in the community where I grew up, right? But cassette tapes themselves are this extraordinary preserve, as I sort of mentioned to you, of this particular language, right? And one of the questions that I think I've been quite interested in is, do oral only languages evolve quicker, right, than languages that have a written form? Just, I don't know. I mean, just by virtue of them being oral, are they more sort of susceptible to, absorbing long words or whatever it is, but essentially it's the cassettes. The cassette system was a really unexpected way of preserving this language. I'm not, again, I think I'm not entirely sure if I've answered anything or whether I've just rambled, but maybe that's what my position is going to be. I will ramble today.
No, I think you brought some interesting questions up in itself there, Vajid, with regards to like that idea of do oral languages develop faster just because of the fact that they're not being recorded in a written form and therefore being recorded for everyone around them. David, I don't know whether or not you want to add on to any of that with regards to some of the research that you're doing, obviously, because I know you look at both Hindi and Urdu as individual languages. What's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's been raised in what both Amina and Vajid have said that's really fruitful. I mean, we could be taking this in all kinds of directions. I mean, I suppose to pick up on some of what Amina was saying, and my research was mostly on the colonial period, right? And I suppose the big questions here are the extent to which, colonialism and then partition kind of impact the situation that we find, right? With regard to language. And, it's undeniable that the fact of colonialism changed the way in which people thought about language across. I mean, not solely with regard to Hindi and Urdu, those are the ones I spend my time thinking about, but other languages in South Asia as well. And it's, I mean, from the kind of, Orientalists and the philologists and the, the Griersons and the Gilchrists and the whoever else of this world, like wanting to map down these languages, wanting to really kind of, get a sense of exactly what they look like, but also to associate them with, particular communities, right? So whether that, in this case, particularly religious communities. So this idea that there was a language of Hindus and a language of Muslims, that there was, or at least a variant of this Hindi-Urdu spectrum that was associated with Hindus at one end and Muslims on the other. Now, I mean, we kind of stress that kind of colonial impact, and it really, shouldn't go away. And when we think about the kind of history of, how we do education as well, this is a crucial point, right? How do we teach this kind of history? That's not to deny the idea that, that Indian or South Asian nationalists had their own agency here as well, right? Groups on both sides, as they mobilized around various kind of sets of politics, incorporated and built upon these ideas of language as a constituent part of people's identity. And I think when you look at the history of that, and when you think about kind of Vajid's point about class, like these are elites, these are elite men, mostly men, mobilizing around the idea of language and its sort of intrinsic connection to a community, and mobilizing them around particular kind of forms of that language. So if we think about what Amina was telling us about, how we think about language as a lingua franca, or if we think about language as kind of crystallized in a certain elite form, whether that's a kind of certain kind of khalis or chaste Urdu, or it's a certain kind of shuddh or pure Hindi. Again, these are, class-based dynamics as well. Very little interest. I mean, there's a professed interest in the colonial period about, language as the medium of education. Therefore, we've got to do X, Y, and Z so that the common man, this kind of always imagined person, will have access to the latest knowledge and will be able to be taught in this. But it's very, there's a certain kind of class-based and patrician interest. And when you think about literary heritages and tastes, again, it's a very kind of upper class and elite set of tastes that is being kind of preserved and mobilized around these ideas of language. So I feel I've wandered off topic slightly, but kind of connecting to particularly to what Amina and Vajid have already talked about. There's a huge amount going on here, and it does. I mean, am I getting too far ahead of myself? But it does get us back to this idea of language and the split between languages and between communities and between nations in the end, quite neatly.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely come back to that final point there, David. I just want to give Tamara a chance to talk about her experience, especially with regards to, obviously she's an author and she does want to represent language and culture of South Asians in her writing as well as her own experiences. Tamara, do you want to pick up on anything that anyone has said thus far?
Yes, I think while we talk about Hindi and Urdu as well, there've been a complex interplay of factors which culminated bifurcation of linguistic boundaries along religious lines. So Urdu became associated with Muslims and Hindi became associated with Hindus. So now when Urdu was enforced on a country where nearly 50% of the population were Punjabi, it led to a hybrid Urdu and Punjabi language, which you'd hear in different parts of Pakistan. And so, whereas the Gurumukhi, which is the official Punjabi writing system that's used in Sikhism, that tradition got lost in Pakistan because that didn't want to be used anymore because of the religious implications. And other languages like Saraiki, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, which was spoken by a large population in Southeast Punjab, that lost its prominence when a lot of those people migrated to India. And also when you enforce a language on people, for example, Hindi. I mean, India and Pakistan both are such diverse, rich places with so many languages spoken. So when you enforce a language like Hindi, well, it causes resentment. So you see that now as well between, say, northern India and southern India, where people in the south prefer speaking in their own mother tongues, and then and there's that resentment between, say, people in New Delhi and people in the south. And so what I'd also like to say is Bengali also has a rich oral history. So folk song was a big part of our culture. We've had different forms of folk songs for the past, I think, from 16th century onwards, and not just the lyrics, but the rhythm, the tunes, they all exist till this day. And it was an amalgamation of both Hindu and Muslim folk singers that came together singing about, well, rural life, about love, about loss, about God, and so many other subjects. And so that's fascinating as well, that how Bengali was transmitted from these rural folk singers and peasants, basically, who continued this tradition till this day, and we still have them in record. Although popularity is definitely reduced now, but that's also a fascinating aspect of language. I'll speak about the impact on Bengali a bit later. But I think that's what I would like to add in regards to the topic.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. So just picking up on some of the points Tamara made there, especially about the folk singers, and we'll come to you, David. How do you think that South Asian languages tie into that idea of identity? And how do you think partition and colonialism have impacted this?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really important conversation, this idea of the folk as well, and the day-to-day. I suppose I started thinking talking a little about how colonialism impacted on this idea of language and this idea of a split, right? With Hindi, Hindu. I mean, again, in the Hindi Urdu context, Hindi equals Hindu on one side, Urdu equals Muslim on the other. But when I was, thinking back to that anecdote I shared at the start, this idea that the one word is, or the one language is a foreign language, right? I mean, it's this idea that once Pakistan was created, or Pakistan and India became independent, that this became a kind of Pakistani or Videshi or foreign language is anachronistic, but deeply held by certain sections of nationalist nationalist inclined types in contemporary India. But my interest was always then to kind of, because this is a pretty well known story, it's been pretty well told. We know this history of divide. There's plenty of scholarship on it, and kind of more popular understandings of it as well. I was interested to start looking at the spaces in between. Right, so I mean that could have taken a line. It didn't, but it could have taken a line like looking towards the kind of folk and the more popular. But looking to those efforts, whether contemporary or historical, right? So pre-partition, kind of keeping language and religious communities together, right? So this kind of ended up with me looking at this, well, not solely, but looking at this idea of Hindustani. And it's not an external category, it's not something that I'm coming along and saying, well, there must be something in between. Although, of course, that was happening with kind of, colonial era linguists as they attempted to pin down and define these different languages I was mentioning before. But it was also happening under the, agency of Hindi and Urdu or Hindustani writers and thinkers, poets and politicians, right? Can I share a little poem? Maybe there's one of my favorite quatrains revised is by a guy called Akbar Allahabadi. This is from early 1900s, and he says, "Hum Urdu ko Arabi kyun na kare, Hindi ko wo bhasha kyun na kare, झगड़े के लिए अखबारों में मजमून तराशा क्यों ना करें, आपस में अदावत कुछ भी नहीं लेकिन एक अकारा कायम है, जब इससे फलक का दिल बहले हम लोग तमाशा क्यों ना करें." Which basically means, why don't we turn Urdu into Arabic and Hindi into Sanskrit? Why don't we, in order to start a fight, why don't we start writing articles in the newspapers? So there we have that kind of new print technology coming in, right? Why don't we put these in the akhbars? There is no reason for mutual animosity, right? There's no reason for us to hate each other. But there is a stadium that's been prepared, and when this pleases the hearts of the heavens, then why shouldn't we make a scene, right? Roughly. So this idea of kind of purifying languages, of turning Urdu into Arabic and making it more like this kind of, Arabic and Persian influence thing, turning Hindi into Sanskrit, spurging all the kind of so-called foreign influences, was the kind of that idea of, purity and purifying and distinguishing. But even within these communities, these writing literary communities, they're kind of pushing against that and thinking, like, let's not, because he was being sarcastic. He wasn't suggesting we actually do that. He's saying, this is a farce. Let's think about this in other ways. So it's always looking at these other ways of thinking about language and community that deny the politics of division. I guess that's what's motivated me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautiful poem. I do not understand the language, but I just fell into the words as you were saying them. I'd really like to pick for Amina to pick up on that idea of language and communities, and how language can bring communities together and potentially push them away. Amina, do you have anything that you can add with regards to sort of looking at that community side? Don't forget to unmute.
Will do. Yeah, I can. There's so much that's been talked about that has been thought-provoking. But to go back to that point about community and language, and I suppose folktale, well, what is it that makes people tick? And I think we're talking about orality as well quite a lot, and poetry, right? So the culture of poetry is a big part of South Asia across the board, and people will recite poetry from in all classes, in all kind of walks of life, to talk about things, or to and also not just poetry. Also, I'm thinking about the Qissa tradition, for example, the tales that we have, like similar to Romeo and Juliet. You have Heer Ranjha, you have Soni Mahiwal, you have the kind of Sindhi folk tales, you have the Punjabi folk tales, you have so many ways through which people make sense of life, and through which people talk about that very important emotion of love, which is really sort of being attacked quite a lot in that division of communities. So how do people manifest those ideas? And they do that through those stories, through how they tell a story. And in those stories, you know, as David was referring to Allahabadi, who was quite satirical and ironic in his kind of poetry, you have also the way that writers and poets use those forms to narrate an alternative story to what is being told by the state or to what is being made known as the official story. And of course, you will have a range of people. You know, there'll be the official kind of spokespeople who will be appointed by the state, who will kind of take a particular line, and then there will be others. I mean, and I suppose I was thinking, I mean, if you think about religion and community, you know, if you think of a story like Hi Ranja, for example, you have that whole kind of, you have very strong women, for example, in that story, in that narrative. But within that, you also have a whole discussion about how the Qazi or the person who is the religious figure comes to play a big part in what happens between this kind of, you know, marriage that shouldn't take place between two families according to kind of the status of both and the rivalries between both, etc. So it's quite interesting to think about how that is manipulated through that form and told through that form. But then you've also got, for example, if you think of the story of, I was thinking of what Tamara was saying and thinking about the story of Bangladesh and East Pakistan and West Pakistan and the story of language that is so central, you know, where language becomes yet another point of differentiation between two places that share the same kind of community, idea of community, of a Muslim community, but yet, you know, Bengali, which is the larger majority spoken language at that time, and you have the language rights in the 1952, the student movement in East Pakistan at that time, and how that is represented on the other side, on the West Pakistani side. What is the official story? What do people actually hear when they, you know the political events and what's happening, but what is actually on the ground is very different. So I think of a poet like Faiz, for example, who is a kind of representative, becomes a representative of the arts in Pakistan, is a kind of poet, unofficial poet laureate type of thing, but is also a poet who gets into a lot of trouble because he's a Marxist poet, and he talks about gets involved in kind of political things that sort of land that cause him lots of trouble with the military state. But he also writes these poems that are about that separation between East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and the liberation of Bangladesh, and which are in Urdu, right? And these are not things that people are talking about. They're not available to everybody as something that is a story, is a narrative. So it's told in this poetic form, and it's available also, you know, in other sort of filmic representations. And so I think those kind of forms of art becomes a really important medium through which an alternative story is told about what culture is and what culture is expected to be. So those are the kinds of, so, you know, for example, the Pakistani state will very much appropriate a poet like Iqbal as the official poet, and there will be an appropriation of particular aspects of his poetry that speak to people. And Iqbal can be used, is also used, you know, his poetry is also used by a number of kind of religious parties in their kind of rallies and things like that to motivate and to inspire people. And he can also be used by somebody like Faiz as an influence. How do you, as an individual, you know, try and translate that, try and sort of work that out? What is the culture that you identify and that with, or you think about? And I think it's really people are really complex and people think about things in very complex ways, but that's not always the narrative that's told. That is, so oral culture remains a very important part, I think, of South Asian communities and how they learn to engage and talk to each other. I mean, sadly, we have borders and boundaries and sort of national kind of things like 1971 and partition and all those things, but people need a narrative to be able to have some kind of connection with history, with memory. How do you develop a memory that allows people to talk about those things and then to build new relationships? I think that's really important. So you have this kind of, sorry, just to finish off the point, I know I'm going over. So you have this kind of reliance on the Romance tradition, that people keep going back to the Romance tradition because that's the kind of safe space to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that we're going to talk about language and memory with Majid a bit later on. But I'm really interested in, obviously, the mentioning of things like people telling stories and how these things can influence the language and, appropriating stories from different places. And I'm going to come to Tamara because we have had a comment. Thank you for everyone for commenting. We are reading and trying to look through them. But we have had one that talks about the issue of language becoming strong when Urdu was imposed upon the Bengali-speaking East Pakistanis, which resulted in the Bengal language movement between 1948 and 1952. And obviously, Tamara, you were talking about Bengali and the move for language there. Do you want to just comment on that for us?
Yep, sure. So the impact of language in Bengal was twofold. So you had the partition, and then you also had subsequent movements, so the language movement, and which eventually led to the Liberation War of 1971. So there was a Bengali Renaissance from 18th to early 20th centuries, and language was the driving factor in cultural, social, musical, and even anti-colonial revolutions. And so partition basically contributed in the ending of this Renaissance, with Hindus moving to West Bengal and majority of Muslims moving to back then East Pakistan. So while Bengal was divided based on religious boundaries, we continued speaking Bengali, across borders, only with difference in accents and dialects. And so we, be it Hindus, Muslims, or Christians, we speak the same Bengali with variations with words and religious phrases mostly. And we share a rich culture of literature, music. Many of you might know Rabindra Sangeet, or Rabindranath Tagore. He wrote the national anthem of both Bangladesh and India. And Nazrul Giti as well, and poetry. So there was a very rich culture of Bengali. And so obviously when post-partition East Bengal became part of Pakistan, there was this resentment because Bengalis were seen as inferior. And in 1952, Pakistan declared Urdu as the sole official language of East Pakistan, which wasn't taken well for obvious reasons, leading to Dhaka University students protesting with, as was mentioned, police ended up killing 5 students. So this led to widespread civil unrest until Bengali was granted official status in 1956. So now there was advocacy as well to write Bengali in Arabic script, and basically Bengalis did not want to do that, So sorry, what was I trying to say? Yeah, so they did not want to do that, and so it was said by Pakistanis that Bengali represented the Hindu culture, and we Bengalis did not get out of that, and we continued being part of the Hindu culture, and not adopting Persian-Arabic script did not show that we did not want to embrace our Islamic identity. So this movement was the catalyst for future movements and the rising tensions between Urdu speaking in Bengali-speaking Pakistan eventually led to the Liberation War of 1971. And so while there was use of Urdu in East Pakistan, Urdu was seen with skepticism after the language movement, and more so after the Liberation War. And in the present day, only a small community of Pakistanis who decide to stay back after liberation, and a colloquial version of Urdu that's spoken by old Dhaka residents. Urdu is no longer spoken in Bangladesh. And yeah, I think even though there was those religious differences, well, basically the main identity of Bengal was the language. I mean, we named our country after a language. We called ourselves Bangladesh. So that was the integral part of our identity. And it's quite fascinating to see. I mean, it's how patriotic and nationalistic we were about our core identity of language, because it influenced every part of our lives. And yeah, to be the only country in the world to fight for the right to speak that language and make it official is, I think, something quite proud, something to be quite proud of. And it was recognized by 21st February, when there was the start of the protests for Bengali. That's been recognized by the UN as the International Mother Language Day. Yeah.
Fascinating. I didn't know that about the Language Day. So that's definitely something I'm taking away from today. I think we will come back to you to talk a little bit more about those different factors that influence different regions of language. But just before I do so, I want to give Ajid a chance to speak as well. Obviously, we've talked a lot about stories, about communities together, about how language can be divisive and how it can bring people together. With your experience and also obviously the project of tape letters, what have you found, Ajid, when people have been talking to you?
I was just about to sort of relay exactly what we've just found on the back of the talks here. Just to give you a bit of an idea about what it was like for people like me, I had no idea that Pakistan was India. I had no idea that Bangladesh was Pakistan. So I think, David, you may underestimate kind of like how removed we are from this kind of situation, understanding this reality. And what we found is there's some interesting reasons that might sort of explain this, right? One thing is people like my mum had no way of framing this. They're patriots, right? They were 10 years old or whatever when sort of, when that partition happened. And so they're fused with this idea of patriotism of Pakistan and actually are really quite stoic about what really happened. And so for her, it's actually no big deal, right? Actually, what actually happened is part of life, because death is life, right? It's really just part of what happens in the world. The other people that we interviewed as part of the Tape Letters project, we weren't really expecting to touch on partition and language within the actual, within the project itself. But with some people that we interviewed, as soon as we spoke to them about partition, they were like, "Interview's over. We're not going to talk to you anymore." And we realized trauma is no joke. I mean, trauma is being carried by these people, and it's a very real thing. And then the question then becomes like, if you are carrying this trauma and you are a migrant, why pass it on, right? Why pass that on? You want to shield your children from it. So in some way, there's these two-pronged potentially two reasons. One, our parents might have been educated enough to actually relay that. Secondly, that people who did know about this were actively holding it back for various reasons, right? So there's some really interesting thing about, as I was sort of going through all of this stuff, trying to make sense of this over the years, right? And not since Tape Letters itself. But if you don't mind, what I'll do is, if this works, I'd like to just share my screen of some photographs that we've taken, which will shine light on something which I think Tamara's just said, right? Is that okay with you guys? Yeah, okay. Let's sort of see if this works. Okay. I'm going to, these are the passports of this person, okay? That's my mum. And this whole sort of project really stemmed, from some of her memories. And I'll not really sort of go into that. But what I do want to do is to just go back to that original photograph of her passport. So that in Urdu, let me see if I can sort of increase the size of this thing. Hopefully that's sort of legible. It says Pakistan passport in Urdu, right? I couldn't figure out what that actually said. I presumed it was Hindi. Of course, we know what it is now, right? But that's pre-1971 passport for her. And then you can sort of see post-71 that says Islamic Jamhuriyat Pakistan, right? The Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And that says passport. And then it says in Arabic, it says Jawaz al-Safar there, right? And you can see how that sort of shift is, from this idea that Bengali as a language is just infused with what makes Pakistani identity, right? And of course, we've got a blue passport. All the sort of Brexiteers will be cheering that it's, we're returning to this idea of a blue passport. Anyway, a British passport, right? And so this person that we interviewed, my mum, of course, she hasn't changed, but of course, the way the state sees her has, right?
I don't think we can see your screen, Rajid, but what we might do is I might not be able to, but if you're happy to share them on socials, we can share them after the talk on our socials so that people
I see.
Can get
so you can see these screens I was sharing.
From the comments, it doesn't look like it. Thank you for letting us know, guys.
No. Okay. All right. Well, I'll stop that. It's a shame. Okay, so that would have been interesting. So you couldn't see the passports there. Oh no. Okay. That's a real shame because let me try one more time. If we can't do that, then I'll just skip it. Okay, because it really is, I think, quite useful. Given what we just talked about. So you still can't see this? You can see this now. Fantastic. Okay.
I can see it. Can somebody let us know? Yeah, we can see in here. Okay, fantastic.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So there we go. So this is the person I was talking about, earlier on, and these are the passports I was referring to. Can you see that? Okay. They're really interesting, aren't they? Look at that. Now, she hasn't changed, right? But the way the state obviously sees her has, and the way the state sees itself has changed, right? And of course, the language itself, you can see it's just encoded on the national identity here in the way that they see her. And there we go. This is what I mean about Pakistani passport. And honestly, it was only about 2-3 years ago when I found out that was Bengali. But of course, it just penny dropped. Of course, it's going to be Bengali, right? Of course. And you can see here, that's what I meant by the second half of it, Jawaz al-Safar, right? In Arabic, presumably it means passport, right? Yeah, interesting. I suppose a revelation, really, for someone like me to understand that this is extraordinary trauma that's happened, and that we're just unaware of it for multiple reasons.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Radit. As I said, if you we can try and share them over socials as well if people want to have a closer look at that later on. Sure. Speaking of trauma, I think if we can go back to what Tamara was saying about enforcing languages on individuals, and obviously the Bengali people naming Bangladesh after their language. If you want to, could you comment any more on that idea of that idea of trauma because of enforcing languages, Tamara? What effect do you think it had on those people?
Well, I think we carry the trauma to this day. When I talk to my Bangladeshi friends in particular, the patriotism because it's not that in the distant past, because our parents' generations fought in the Liberation War, or our grandfathers were involved in the language movement. So it's still quite raw, and And when we talk to Pakistanis, for example, and if they grew up in Pakistan, they did not learn about this whole movement, or that there was a war where between East Pakistan and Pakistan for our own determination, and that's left out of history books. And I guess that riles Bangladeshis up even more, because such an integral part of our history is completely excluded from textbooks. So the trauma does exist, and we do see that. I saw in the comments that someone mentioned that Biharis, as we have. So Biharis are basically Pakistanis who stayed back in Bangladesh, or who weren't able to go to Bangladesh, and they still live in refugee camps in Bangladesh till this day, and they have been granted Bangladeshi nationality, and they can't go back to Pakistan either. So they're basically left stateless. They grow up in those refugee camps. They've been living there for 50 years now, nearly 50 years, and yeah, so there's that trauma because they're Urdu speaking. We don't want to accept them as part of our community. And there are also, say, working class people. So I guess they did not get the help that they needed to get the determination. Whereas we do still have that small community of Pakistanis or Urdu speaking families who still exist. But their Urdu is limited to what they speak at home. When they're outside, when they're mingling with others, they speak in Bengali. So there has been, because of the trauma that we experienced in that length of time, Urdu is still not seen favorably. And it can be seen in all, basically in all parts. We are obsessed with Bollywood, when it comes to cricket. There are a lot of Pakistani supporters, but I think there are a lot more Indian supporters as well. Bangladesh only came into the cricket scene not that long ago, so it was always either India or Pakistan that we supported. And you see that, when you talk about traveling, people will say, I want to go to India, but I don't want to travel to Pakistan because of, what happened. Or, I have debates and arguments with my friends about it, and they say that, Pakistan never issued an apology, an official apology to Bangladesh for what they did. And how can we forgive them without this official apology? So it's still hard for a lot of Bangladeshis to move on from that because of the stories they've heard from their parents, and because it hasn't been that long ago. So that trauma exists, and it will definitely take a lot more time to work through that trauma, and basically come to a moment where we can accept what's happened and move on from it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tamara. I think it's I'm being a huge cricket fan. I've seen Bangladesh come on the scene recently, and it's interesting how, I know we're talking about language today, but one of the things that the Partition Education Group are very in favour of is seeing how different cultures, specifically South Asian culture, has impacted Britain and the English culture, for example. And there is something about that influence of different languages that are coming in to England and having the influence on British language. So we get combinations, I think that David mentioned earlier on, of things like Hinglish. So David, do you want to just comment on the fact that the idea of languages coming into Britain and then getting these hybrid languages that we see?
Sure, I can try. I mean, I actually think this has less to do with languages coming into Britain than it does have with other languages being in South Asia in the context of English. I mean, not to say that English, as an example, as a kind of portmanteau representing Hindi and English combined, doesn't happen in the UK, but it's very much a kind of living language, if you like, of all of its own in South Asia, in India, and that's partly to do with the very long history of languages mixing. I mean, when we talk about languages and states or languages and communities, we tend to come from this sort of monolingual perspective, this idea, this Europeanist perspective. There's a language and there's a state, and that's a natural kind of thing. And whereas when we look at the kind of like linguistic diversity of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but really stretching back, a long time. And in the case of English, English has been in the subcontinent for, since the arrival, since before the arrival of the English as a colonizing force, right? But in terms of education, again, tied up with colonialism, it's there. It's likewise tied up with class and tied up with colonial misunderstandings of the value of various languages and all the rest of it in South Asia. And today, the way in which these languages mix and intermingle is rich, and it's productive, and it produces kind of culture all of its own, be that novels, be that television, be that elements of Bollywood and cinema and all the rest of it. It also produces anxiety, and I think what's really interesting as a kind of link between some of the different languages we've been talking about is that relationship between language and linguistic authorities, or language and the state, and language and the control over language. English is actually, the more kind of prominent example would be with Singlish and the Singaporean context, and really the Singapore government very down on this mixing, this creolization of languages. They really don't want to hear that. They don't want to see it. They ban it from radio and all the rest of it. But there is an anxiety around language mixing, language impurity, language, depending on where you're sitting. So English is that kind of one of those things that really stands out as a kind of, a great confluence of languages coming together, not in a kind of overly celebratory or sort of patsy way, but just as the lived reality of the way in which people use and shape language to their own ends. And I think that's far more interesting than government mandates.
Yeah, I think it's more of a living, breathing thing to examine, rather than, as you say, those mandates that are handed down to us as official records, in inverted commas, where they want to record certain things in history. Which actually, it brings me nicely on to Ajid and this question about things like memory and preservation of language, especially given evolution across generations, existence of oral only languages like Pothwari. How are you using, can you tell us a little bit about tape letters and how you're using sort of the technology to preserve these elements of language, and why you think this is important?
So we managed to get our hands on about 40 cassettes. So to give you an idea of the project itself, most of these cassettes that they were recorded here. There's some that were recorded in various other countries, because obviously not everybody came to the UK. Post Second War. So we have some recordings from Canada, in particular. This whole project really started off 3 years ago in my mum's home, really, when I stumbled on one of these cassettes when I was looking for one of my dad's knots. So he was a devotional hymn singer, right? And so we would have people coming to our homes listening to him sing knots. That was the thing. And he would be sort of invited to sing in their homes. And it got to the point where they were asking him to record these knots on cassette tapes. So he would give these cassette tapes to various people in the community, and they'd listen to him sing knots in their own homes, right? He passed away about 20 odd years ago. It was about 5 years ago when I was looking for one of these knot tapes that I knew my mum would have. And as I found one of these knot tapes, but I also found these other tapes, which I knew weren't knot tapes. And in fact, as soon as I had one of these things, I was like, I remember this. I remember being pulled into this when I was a little kid. Like, say hello, say salam to some auntie or uncle in Pakistan, Salam alaikum auntie, salam alaikum uncle, asantika, tosatiko, bas khudafis, and we're off, right? That was the extent of what we sort of contributed to that tape message. Anyway, I stumbled on these tapes and sort of realized that I had something sort of fairly significant as a historical artifact, really, as a kind of a preserve of language, but not only language, just of experience. That's the thing. It isn't just my thing wasn't just interested in the language. It was just really how the medium, the cassette medium, given that I'm my interest in sound, right? How that could, how that was sort of a interesting preserve of experiences, right? Of time. Essentially, it's a sort of a sonographic snapshot. That's the way I've been sort of trying to think of this, right? And of course, so what we found was that on the language, that on the cassettes themselves, it's it's Pothwari that is predominantly sort of spoken, and Pothwari, from what we found out, is a sort of what's known as a transitional language. So it exists between Punjabi and another language called Hindi. It's somewhere sort of in between these two sort of languages. And it has no written form, as I sort of mentioned, right? So that caused us some sort of problems with how do we relay something like this, right? How do we sort of pass on the information, and that's in these cassettes, right? First of all, actually, we found that very few people were willing to give us the cassettes in the first instance. You know, they were very sort of cagey about handing over these cassettes because they contained extraordinarily private messages. You can imagine they weren't meant for people like us to listen to, right? So we sort of undertook all these interviews before we managed to find any cassettes. But when we did, you know, we sort of uncovered all these extraordinary themes about migration and about identity, about early sort of experiences in the UK, you know, and about languages and what have you. One of the things that we were really keen on doing was sort of avoiding a mistake, which I think a lot of oral history projects generally do, which is they look into a particular group, right? Whether that community is based on sexual orientation or ethnicity or religious identity, whatever, a community, they draw that information, and then it's just relayed for special interest groups, right? It's relayed to, you know, archivists, right? Or, you know, essentially far removed from the people that have provided this information in the first instance. So we were really sort of wanted to avoid that trap, right? So we took the effort of transliterating Pothwari using Urdu, so we could get close to the phonic. And I think actually it gets close to this, to the, you know, the Shah Mukhi script of Punjabi. It's the similar kind of thing. So if you can read Urdu, you can get close to the phonics of Pothwari, right? And then we translated that. So it was a huge sort of endeavor to make that happen. But what we could do was then relay some of this stuff in the various exhibitions that we put on. So we were invited to put on an exhibition at the People's History Museum in Manchester, and it was chosen as a community project there, and it was on there for a month. And we had special, so we had private, you know, private views for people that had contributed to the archive. And we had people crying and we had people laughing in these exhibition spaces. But one thing, they'd never set foot inside the exhibition spaces because they're not invited to these places. They're not spaces for them, right? So we were able to relay their stories in their language. But what we also found out was that marginalization isn't just tied to these people from that generation, from that particular generation. Marginalization also includes people like me who had no idea about this, and certainly like the millennial types who have no idea about language and history in this kind of way. So that was a really interesting sort of facet that we really didn't think we'd find at the beginning of the project.
Fascinating. I mean, you've got quite a good website, haven't you, Rajid, with regards to information. So, and obviously you can get him on socials as well. I know that we are coming up to time. So if you do have any questions for one of our particular speakers tonight, please drop a comment in with the name, with your question and the name of the speaker that you would like to hear from, and we will see if we can get round to them at the end. Just very finally, something for not just our speakers to consider, but also our audience as we've been listening in. I'm going to ask you very quickly, just for maybe just a minute or so, can you all comment on whether or not you think partition was the major cause for language change? Do you think South Asian languages might have been different had partition not happened? Would tongues have been divided if lands had not been? And going back to the title of the talk today. So Amina, we would like to start with you. What would your very quick thoughts be on whether or not partition caused this?
That's a big question. I think the relationship to language is definitely influenced by partition quite a lot in relation to how people think of that Hindi Hindu, Urdu, Muslim kind of divide that was talked about before. I think also partition really maps the nation, right? So nations demand a particular type of monolingual culture. If you want to talk about a connection with the UK, and you think about a kind of monoculture of language that is English, where you don't really have multiple, like it's you know, I don't want to get into Brexit really, but it isn't quite it isn't a kind of multilingual society in the same way, regardless of the fact that you have multicultures present and you have multiple languages spoken in this country. But I think that sort of that project of nationalism in itself requires one language to be the main language in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. Different nations have come up with different solutions. You know, India had things like the 3-language formula, and in Pakistan, you know, you have different solutions that were used in Sindh. There's different ones used in Punjab. So how the state thinks about it is different. And then in the UK, I think, and I think that question of migration and refugee status as well that comes with partition, it entirely changes your relationship to identity and language, because migrants will often, regardless of what the Home Secretary might say, will want to assimilate and integrate to be a part of the culture that they are going into, rather than to stand out in the crowd, because that is always harder. So I think from what Wajid was saying and speaking about his mum and that sort of generational experience, I think what I learned from my parents' generation was also that they just chose the language that they felt for us that would allow us to assimilate better in the new nation than the ones that were their kind of mother tongues, or that, I mean, like, you know, we don't even have kosher spoken in any part of the Kashmiri family, in our family, but that's just, you know, the degree of migration and movement that's happened and how that's evolved. So I would say that's had a huge impact.
And obviously with partition being a huge mass migration of people and culture and language, as we've seen this evening. Tamara, do you think that partition has been quite a large cause for language change, especially in comparison to the fact that obviously Bangladesh as well was much later identified as a country in its own right?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, there was a Bengali Renaissance, which effectively ended with the partition. So while we still have a rich culture of poetry and writings and songs, perhaps there definitely has been that because of the split between West Bengal and Bangladesh, we lost a lot of brain's trust through that process. And so that rich history that we had probably did not continue as it could have if it wasn't for partition. And then also, you know, so the trauma that was experienced by Bangladeshis, that also impacted on the patriotism and the nationalism and the core identity of Bangladeshis in particular. So that was also driven by partition and the subsequent events that took place. So yeah, for in the aspect from the perspective of Bengali, definitely there was a big influence. I mean, even after the partition, basically all official documentation and education system was basically convened in Bengali. So there was that loss of, say, the English language and Urdu languages, the English and Urdu languages from Bangladesh, and which led to English being limited to elite classes until, say, a few decades ago. So in conclusion, there was a big impact on Bengali from partition.
Thank you. And very quickly, I'm just going to go to Wajid. From your experience, would you say tongues have been divided if lands had not? Oh, Wajid, you're on mute.
I would say no. I would say no. I would say that language mutates regardless. I think it's sort of the fact that Pothwari sort of exists here as part of sort of this sort of strange floating seed that shouldn't really, it's not native to this country. I think it's just a testament to what language actually is inherently. I think it will constantly mutate, and I think partition itself doesn't stop it. It will never stop mutation of language, and it can't do, right? So my feeling is that, I mean, I'm not a product of, I'm a product of migration, which is not necessarily a product of partition. Of course, there are complex factors that play into that, right? And my sort of understanding of language is fused in a very particular kind of way. In fact, my son speaks Swedish as a second language. So it's interesting how that sort of fuses, but that's changing. It's constant. For me, it's a perfect example of kind of the constant evolution of identity, right? Not just the way language changes itself.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I find it difficult to really come down and say, yeah, it's changed because
language, as you said, language will evolve and develop wherever and whatever happens. David, would you agree with that, or do you think partition had more of a role than just it would have been natural?
I mean, it's a hugely complicated question. I think partition played a big role when it comes to the likes of Hindi and Urdu. I think it's left situations, but it wasn't the sole factor in determining the evolution or the direction of these languages, as far as it says. Amna said, and Tamara, these all go in different directions, and they would do anyway. The association with distinct nation states for Hindi and Urdu, and then the kind of, obviously it's a different situation for Bengali, Bangla, across West Bengal and Bangladesh, but that association with nation states makes for interesting situations with regards to Hindi and Urdu, both as dominating languages, but ones that are always perceived as being under threat or kind of having to defend themselves. But it also makes for interesting moments, and I always go back to that situation about 2 years ago when this sort of sudden viral hashtag was all over Twitter. It was my name in Hindi and my name in Urdu, and this idea of people from across the border attempting to, getting Urdu speakers to tell them how to write their name in Hindi, or getting Hindi speakers how to tell them how to write it in Nagari. So these little moments of kind of cross-border cooperation, again, I'm maybe a bit of a softie, but these are also these moments that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think that's really nice because it ties in with a comment that we've had as a question about what speakers think of in regard to the impact of globalization on in South Asia, of language in South Asia. Does anyone want to jump in? I mean, David's obviously just been talking about the hashtag on Twitter and things like that. Does anyone want to jump in and answer what they think of in regards to the impact of globalization on languages in South Asia? Open to the floor. You've all said everything.
Yeah. I suppose if I can jump in, I can just say I think we've had the answers in terms of globalization and technology coming together. They really shift the relationship to language and oral cultures, doesn't it? Because the next generation is kind of experiencing language in different ways to the way I experienced it, or David, or Wajid, or Tamara or have experienced it, or the way the students. So it's really and it's global. The kind of power relationships change, I think, a lot. So that point about migrancy and where you are in that power relationship of language is very important, because that is what gives you the kind of mobility to be able to be empowered to use the language. But when you don't have that power, it becomes more complicated and more complex, and why certain languages get less used than others. But I think in terms of Urdu, I would say the lingua franca sort of as a global language is really interesting to kind of think of and to sort of see developing in visual cultures. And certainly the future it changes, and it brings a really interesting change to how the language has been sort of in terms of literature, the legacy of the kind of high literature, the canon of literature. I would say that this globalization brings really interesting changes to that.
I feel like that could be a whole other event on its own. I know that our vice chair, Amina, has a question or something, a comment about globalization. Amina?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it quick because we're running short of time. But I mean, I guess I can speak a little bit from my own sort of experiences. If you think of sort of globalization on South Asian languages and its impact, for me on a personal level, I feel like I think of myself, I've grown up mostly in the UAE. I have family in the UK. My parents were born in the UK. And I think, Amina, you kind of touched on it, where when people have migrated over out of South Asia into other diaspora communities all across the world, they feel a pressure to assimilate and fit in because you don't want to stand out. And for that reason, I was taught Urdu, not Punjabi, quite similar to what you mentioned. But I'm finding more and more that people really want to combine their languages with English. And I think from my experiences, these languages are being diluted out because now at home, while I do speak Urdu, I'll probably speak 20% Urdu and the rest of my sentence will be in English. And I find that is so common amongst my friends, amongst my family, because people are so influenced by their surroundings and the country that they're living in. And often it's quite easy to forget sort of the roots and where our languages have actually come from. And a question I had, I'm not sure if we've got time to answer now, but I've always wondered maybe I'll put this out there and everyone can sort of think about it in the evening. But when so many people across South Asia are so scarred by the impacts of partition, and so many people argue that that was the result and the impact of British colonization of India at the time, why is it that people are so fixated on bringing English into their languages and sort of making these languages impure, if you like? Why is it that the term English even exists when, on the one hand, so many people resent the British for what happened in 47, but on the other hand, we've got these languages that are no longer in their true forms, and they're being combined and sort of hybridized with English. I've always wondered that question. Maybe we can all think about it and do a part 2 to this event.
Yeah, I think that in itself would be a fantastic event, Amina. And yeah, definitely we'll put that question out there for you guys on both Twitter, and we'll try and get it up on Instagram as well, because I think that's a really interesting dynamic. Because in my summing up, what I was going to say in an attempt to kind of sum up the huge topics and everything that we've been through today, is the idea that, you know, through culture, through community, through migration, through history, language is the one thing that connects it all. And that development and evolution of language, as you can see, has got a lot of different nuances. So it's been a fascinating discussion, and unfortunately we are out of time, because I do want to honour the time that our wonderful speakers have offered to us this evening, wherever they are. And I would love it if in the comments, actually, I know that a couple of our panelists have already said that within their own education, there wasn't a lot of discussion about South Asian history, their heritage, or even knowing about partition. I know that I knew very little of it before I started working on, for example, Jallianwala Bagh at the museum and the South Asian gallery there. So I would love to know in the comments how many of you have actually come across South Asian history or partition, the history of partition, in your own education while you were growing up. I'd love to know that in the comments. I mean, we do hope that this evening's discussion has emphasised that broad nature of how we can explore the ways partition has influenced our lives, both here in the UK and in the subcontinent and around the world. It isn't just a topic for history. It's also geography, PSHE, religious studies, languages, and very much we do believe at Partition Education Group that learning about partition across a school curriculum in a very multidisciplinary way is going to benefit a multitude of young people and their teachers, and possibly have even further reaching impacts across parents as well, which I think we all agree that would be a much more beneficial system for us to live in. We'd love it if you wanted to continue this conversation, either in regard to the specifics of this event or even about partition education in general. You can look us up on Twitter and Instagram. And of course, do give us a shout if you've enjoyed today's event on either one of those platforms. And let us know if you were taught any South Asian history in school. I know that I wasn't, a lot of other people weren't, and that is very much what we stand for at the Partition Education Group. So thank you to Wajid, Amina, David, Tamara, and Amina for their valuable insights and contributions today, especially considering it's South Asian Heritage Month, and this is part of that. We do hope that it's demonstrated the importance of examining partition's impact and how education about this event can really make a difference. Thank you so much to everyone, and I think we'll close the event there.
That's some furious typing, isn't it?
That's me. Just thank you.